Israel is devastating Gaza, and there are three lies that Israel's apologists keep repeating that should be debunked. They claim that Israel is only responding to rockets. They claim that the Palestinian children Israel kills were being used as human shields. They claim that Israel can solve this crisis with violence. Myth number one, Israel is only responding to rockets. Whenever Israel bombs Gaza, you always hear the claim that Israel is only responding to rockets, typically followed by the question of, what would you do if your neighbor fired rockets into your backyard? But what's important to note here is that Israel is inherently the initiator of violence, because the status quo, before any rockets are fired, is that Israel is an occupying power in the Palestinian territories. And that includes Gaza, where Israel is imposing a suffocating siege that traps Palestinians in Gaza and chokes them off economically, destroys their infrastructure and their healthcare system, and cuts them off from the outside world so that they can't even travel. Not to mention the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank and the denial of rights everywhere. That's the constant violence that Palestinians have been living under for decades. As for this particular escalation, it was also initiated by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who needed a distraction in order to get the world's eyes off of the ethnic cleansing that his government was pushing for in the occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. And what better way to create that distraction than to keep escalating violence against Palestinians to provoke a violent response that he could then use to shift the narrative. And that is precisely what happened, with Israeli forces repeatedly brutalizing Palestinian demonstrators and repeatedly attacking the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the holiest site for Muslims in Palestine, until militants in Gaza did respond. So, what would I do if my neighbors fired rockets into my backyard? Well, if I was minding my own business when they fired them, I would probably be very angry. But if I was suffocating them and destroying their homes and denying them access to clean water and restricting their movement and stealing their land and brutalizing them, I would probably fix my behavior first and then look for a way to make peace with my neighbors. Myth number two, it's not Israel's fault when Palestinian children die by Israeli bombs. Another myth to absolve Israeli forces from responsibility for the civilians they kill is to pretend that the only reason why they died is because Palestinian militants were using them as human shields. Now, to be clear, Palestinian militants who do not have fighter jets or tanks or a proper military do use guerrilla tactics and operate in civilian areas. But that is not the definition of human shields. In fact, the only party whose use of human shields as a regular practice is indisputable is actually the Israeli military. And when the Israeli Supreme Court ruled in 2005 that the Israeli military could no longer use Palestinian civilians as human shields, the Israeli military establishment was really upset. And yet, in the last Israeli war on Gaza in 2014, when 2 Israeli soldiers were caught using a Palestinian boy as a human shield, Human Rights Watch described the punishment that they got from the Israeli military as a slap on the wrist. As for why Palestinian children and other civilians are actually killed in Israeli bombings, it's because human rights organizations have found substantial evidence that Israel engages in reckless and indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, and they say that these attacks amount to war crimes. Myth number 3. There is a military solution to this crisis. After countless Palestinians and Israelis are killed in another round of violence that disproportionately affects Palestinians, nothing will have fundamentally changed. Palestinians will continue to be an oppressed people living under occupation, and Israel will continue to be an oppressor that is imposing occupation and apartheid on Palestinians. True peace will only come through justice, when Israel begins to treat Palestinians like equal human beings who are deserving of the same dignity and rights that Israelis are entitled to. The real impediment to peace is that the US gives Israel unconditional military aid and unconditional diplomatic support, which gives Israel a sense of impunity to keep violating Palestinian rights. If we want to bring about peace, then we need to condition US military aid to Israel on Israel abiding by international law and respecting Palestinian human rights. That accountability can create a new dynamic that will bring us closer to equality and justice.